Welcome to The Reason Why with John Mackay, the creation guy from creationresearch.net. Each week, John and his team of creation researchers from around the globe will help you discover answers to your questions about creation, Noah's flood, God, the Bible, and much more. I'm John Ricks, and I host this program, so let's welcome John Mackay. John, tell me a little bit about yourself and where all this came from.
I sort of run a group all around the globe, as we've said in the introduction, who research the subject of creation. Most of us have sort of degrees in science, are involved in professional science. Myself has a background in geology and science education, but we have people with degrees in psychology and some with theology, and it's been of great interest to us, this whole creation versus evolution, particularly the rise in atheism in the West, which has largely been founded on Darwin's theory of evolution. So I basically run the group called Creation Research, and folks can catch us on the web at creationresearch.net.
John, why would a scientist who really should be supporting, you'd think, the evolution theory, support the Bible theory?
Okay, there's a couple of things in there, John, that I need to address. And one is, when I was a geology student at Queensland University, we had a textbook by Professor Carter from Cambridge University, and I was an evolutionist at the time, right? I didn't grow up with a background in Christian things or the church. But the thing that intrigued me about this textbook we used in paleontology, if I remember correctly, was called Vertebrate Habitat and Structure in Evolution. So a big fancy title, and the professor was from Cambridge University, which, as you know, is not a little backwater place. And anyway, it was full of diagrams on evolution, you know, fishes growing legs and turning into frogs, and reptiles growing wings and turning into dinosaurs. And the diagrams intrigued me because that was what I thought was the real history of the world. But then at the end of every chapter, he would have, "But you can't see this in the rocks." And I'd scratch my head. Now, I'm one of these blokes who I learn a lot with pictures, right, rather than just lots of text. And this picture kept coming over. Here's the diagram, but you can't see this in the rocks. So by the time I'd left Queensland University, qualified in geology, I'd begun to doubt the theory of evolution, because if you can't see it in the rocks, you certainly can't see it happening around you at the moment. I took up 3 years of genetics to try and find out how living things work. And I still remember the professor in charge of genetics saying, "We just don't know how evolution can happen because it takes so long to happen, we can't see it happen." And I thought, okay, crazy. Why doesn't the world know this? Why do we have such confidence in it when you can't actually see it either in the present world or in the rock? So I guess you can say that's the point where I started to really doubt the theory of evolution. And then in the real world, when I got out there having to dig up rocks and fossils, I had to agree Charles Darwin was right. In his chapter on geology, that is, where he said the worst part of my theory, the part that helps me least, is the fossil evidence. And someone in geology like myself, I've got to say, fossils are no help to evolution. But what they do is consistently give support to the biblical concept that God created things separately. So that the fishes, when they appear, they're fishes. The frogs are frogs. The oldest looking frog looks like a frog. And so I finally gave up evolution and began to get interested in the subject, and established eventually the group called Creation Research.
Well, I guess they call it the theory of evolution, don't they? It's not proven, so it's still a theory.
Well, chapter 1 in the textbook in high schools usually says, "Welcome to the theory of evolution." Then by the second paragraph it says, 200 million years ago, here's what the amphibians began to do. So it's fact by the second paragraph. So if you did a survey of people like, say, David Attenborough, who's far more famous than I am, right, and much better funded, you would find he believes evolution is a fact in the same way gravity is a fact, right? It's not a theory anymore. I have a big segment of Richard Dawkins and me. Richard Dawkins was the world's biggest atheist evolutionist on the planet. He believes evolution is a fact, and a proven fact. Right, so whilst the theory is still used as a word, it's more a question of how do we think it happened rather than whether it did. So fact is a better word for the way it's used or treated in textbooks and museums.
For the average person, though, John, it's a lot easier to think of evolution rather than this person we've never seen, God, creating this thing. It's much easier to say, well, there are apes and they look a bit like us, so we descended from the apes.
you've got an interesting point there, John. And in reality, what people need to do is to challenge their whole education system because they've been taught what to think. The only reason that sounds sensible is they've been taught it from year one, like I was, in public school, through high school, through university. That was your perceived wisdom, and you didn't dare venture out of it. In fact, let's be blunt, John, very few people are ever brave enough to venture outside the box, really. But if you start asking questions, like I remember going to my colleagues and saying, I think I've got a way to teach creation. And they said, you can't do that. I said, well, all I need to do is ask this question. If it is true that the world was created, what would the evidence be? If mankind was always separate from the apes, what would the evidence be? They said, you can't ask that. I said, I just did. What's the answer? And they didn't know the answer. And I said, well, you've been brainwashed to believe in an answer without ever having to think about it. So there's the real problem. It sounds easy to think about, but only because we've been brainwashed with atheistic evolution from kindergarten onwards.
You're listening to The Reason Why with John Mackay, the creation guy from creationresearch.net. John, what is it you do? How do you research creation, and what's this program about?
Well, remember the question that I figured out that we should ask, how would you recognise? I mean, if we're scientists, like I was involved in, and most of my colleagues are in creation research, then you have the freedom to ask a question. The question is, what's the answer? If it is true that man was created, if it is true that we didn't happen by millions of years of chance random processes called evolution, what would the evidence be? So much of the time we spend trying to say, okay, if God created things after their kind, like the biblical account of Genesis says, what would the evidence be? I'm also brave enough to say, if the Aboriginal story about creation is correct, because inherently they are creationists. They're not evolutionists. They object to being regarded as the end product of evolution. And you've got to ask, if that's true, what would the evidence be? If Noah's flood is true, what would the evidence be? And every student on the planet is entitled to ask that question and seek to answer it. So, number one, we spend a lot of time out there, particularly me in geology, digging up rocks and fossils. We have an outdoor fossil dig site at Gympie. We take people on dinosaur digs and challenge them to think, did this dinosaur live here? Did it die here? Or is it just dead here? Did it get washed in? If so, how come there's 200 kilometres of dinosaur bones all pointing in the same direction? Is that a flood? What flood? And so we spend a lot of time doing actual research. As I said, we run creationresearch.net, and people just can go on there and have a look at the fossils for themselves that we've dug up. So that's one thing we do. Obviously, I get asked a lot of questions. You're playing that role today, right? And in this series of The Reasons Why Radio broadcast. And in fact, it doesn't matter whether it's students in high school who want to know, well, okay, if God made man, how come some of us are black, right? How come some of us are white? If Noah's flood is real, how did kangaroos swim to Mount Ararat to get on board? I get asked questions like that, both from students and professors of geology. So we spend quite a bit of time on campuses, high school and university. I was amazed not long ago. I was at Adelaide University and the meeting hall was packed. But mostly it was the atheist club there and the agnostic club there, right? And they had all their questions organised. Because obviously if atheism is true, there should be no evidence of creation, and therefore there's lots of antagonistic questions they want to pose to me and to my colleagues. So I'll get questions sent in over the web or the internet, and that's one thing we're encouraging people to do with this program, and then they'll be farmed out to our experts all around the globe, whether it's people in the University of British Columbia or one of our professors from Leeds University or whatever, and we focus them together and present them in a program like this.
Can I ask you a question about what you believe? It's hard to believe that God created the heavens, the earth, all the plants, everything in 6 days and had a day off to rest. Do you believe that that's a parable, a story to explain creation, or do you believe it is fact in every way possible?
Okay, let's break your statement down into two bits. It's hard to believe. Now, you can see from my grey hair now, John, that I've been on this planet for a little while. And having done geology and having done genetics, it's harder to believe that millions of years of chance could produce a radio compere as good looking as you. right? Because that's what the theory of evolution is all about. And then this radio compare comes in here, and I watched you set up this equipment intelligently. And you and I know that if you tried to let it happen randomly, it don't work, right? And yet we have a very popular theory out there that says millions of years of random chance, naturalistic type processes produced an organised being called man and this universe. So it's even harder to believe in evolution. There's the first part. The second part, I guess you can say I left university with 4.6 billion years of evolution in my head. I began to challenge evolution based on the evidence of fossils and the genetic stuff that I'd learned, that we have no idea how to turn an amphibian into a bird. We just don't know how you'd even achieve that intelligently using genetic engineers, let alone let it happen by itself. But then I moved further. I started to begin to doubt the billions of years for one simple reason. My wife and I bought a house out, in the beautiful countryside outside of the lovely town of Brisbane. All you tourists out there, come and visit us. We need the tourist dollars in Australia. But then the rocks that house is built on, as I researched them, they actually changed ages 3 times in the last century. And I thought, hang on, which is the real age, or is this last one just the latest theory? And as I investigated the ages of fossils even, I found one fossil from Australia in the British Museum, which in 1910 was 70 million years old. I first refound it in 1987. It was 200 million years old. Then I had a lecture to give at Cambridge University in 1997, and it was 230 million years old. And I thought, that's aging faster than my poor old mum, right? So, which is a fact? No, it's not a fact. So I began to challenge the belief that I had in millions of years. Where have I got to? Now I have, to be honest, no problem at all in believing that a supernatural God, a being who could come to this earth called Jesus, who could turn water into wine in just a few words, would have any problem making a universe in just 6 days. So I'm one of these, I guess you can say I accept it the way it seems to be written. Because when I've given that text out to kids in school and say, what does it tell you? Well, kids don't have all these theories up in their head to hide behind. They say, hey, mister, that says God made the world in just 6 days. And that's its first and obvious meaning, and I have no problem with it, even from a scientific perspective.
John, it is easier to believe in a man who lived virtually in our time 2,000 years ago. There's a hill called Calvary, and there's churches where it's said that he went to. So there's proof that he was on the earth. It's history. It's a little harder to believe that he rose from the dead, sure, but it's not a big leap of faith. But creation is such a leap of faith, isn't it?
It does seem like that until you're someone like me who comes to Christ. I became a Christian. I never hide that from anybody, whether it's Richard Dawkins or the BBC. But what you discover when you become a Christian is, well, a Christian is someone who's a disciple of Christ. Okay, what did Jesus have to say on this issue? There's several things. Number one, he said in John's Gospel, which is New Testament stuff, right? John's Gospel, chapter 5, if you believed Moses, you would believe me. Uh-oh. Moses is the bloke associated with the 10 Commandments. One of the 10 Commandments says, in 6 days I created the heavens and the earth, says God, and the 7th day I rested, therefore 6 days you will labour, and the 7th day you will rest. So all of a sudden, associated with the moral system of Jesus Christ is the concept of creation. And then you find in the same John's Gospel, John writes in chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word. Okay, Genesis says in the beginning. In John's Gospel, it says all things were made by him, so the subject is creation. In Genesis, it says, in the beginning God created, so the subject is creation. Then John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 5 says, and the light shone in the darkness. Genesis says, and God said, let there be light. In the beginning was the Word was Jesus, and Jesus said, let there be light. All of a sudden, when people say, I like this Jesus, question, who is he? Answer, the creator of Genesis. No wonder he said, if you don't believe Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you don't really believe me. Now, for someone like me, trained in geology, hang on, I've got to sort out a few issues here. And I guess you can say it's the 20 years of looking into this that has produced this issue of creationresearch.net and sort of given us a bit of experience to answer the questions out there. We're encouraging people to send in to questions@creationresearch.net. Email them in.
You've been listening to The Reason Why with John Mackay, the creation guy from creationresearch.net. To get your questions answered about God, Jesus, the Bible, and the real history of planet Earth, the universe, and everything else in it, simply email questions@creationresearch.net. That's questions@creationresearch.net.